They found his teeth before they found his name. The Hudson River lapped softly at the pier, like it hadn't swallowed a man whole hours earlier. Frank Marino crouched, cigarette trembling between his fingers, as Detective Carter's flashlight beam swept over the blood-slick planks. Rosa Marino said, "That's not him." But her voice broke on the last word. Above them, the fog pressed down like a curse, muffling the sound of distant tugboats. Frank had seen enough to know whoever did this wanted him to watch. "It's a message," he muttered. Carter nodded, jaw tight. Somewhere beyond the chain-link fence, footsteps scraped against concrete, fading into the mist. The stench of gasoline lingered. Frank's gut twisted. He'd buried friends before, but this was different. This was family. And whoever had crossed that line had already signed their own death warrant. Frank walked home through streets slick with rain, the city's neon bleeding into oily puddles. Rosa followed, her boots splashing through the gutter. She asked, "You think it's Sal?" Frank didn't answer. In his mind, he saw Salvatore Russo's crooked smile from last summer, the one that said he knew too much. The Marino and Russo families had shared wine, blood and bullets for decades. But alliances in Jersey were brittle, and one push could splinter them. Frank lit another cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating the crease in his brow. "If it is Sal," he finally said, "he just made the last mistake of his life." A siren wailed somewhere uptown, and Frank felt the walls closing in. In the underworld, there were no warnings, only messages. The Marino family diner smelled of burnt coffee and regret. Frank slid into the back booth, away from the windows. His cousin Vinny sat across, chewing a toothpick like it was a vendetta. "Word is Russo boys are moving on our docks," Vinny said. Frank leaned back, eyes narrowing. The diner's jukebox played a love song too soft for the air's tension. A waitress passed, pretending not to hear. Frank said, "They're not moving in. They're declaring war." Vinny spat the toothpick into an empty coffee cup. Then we hit back. Outside, headlights slowed as if watching. Frank drove Rosa home, the wipers squealing against the glass. She stared out, jaw tight. "You're not telling me everything," she said. He gripped the wheel harder. Outside, the city blurred into streaks of yellow and gray. "Some truths don't keep you safe," he said. Rosa's voice was quiet, but sharp as glass. "Or maybe you're afraid I'll act on them." He didn't answer. The night pressed in around them, and Frank realized fear felt heavier when it was for someone else. At home, Frank poured bourbon into a chipped glass. The apartment smelled of rain and cigarette smoke. He unfolded a faded photo of him, Rosa, and a younger man with the same eyes. His brother Anthony, gone for 10 years. A knock at the door froze him. 3 slow raps, 1 fast. That was the old signal. He opened it to find a blood-stained envelope, no messenger in sight. Inside was a Polaroid, Anthony's grave, freshly dug up. Frank's hand tightened until the paper bent. War wasn't coming. It had already started. Dawn broke like a bad promise over Holy Redeemer, where the grass held last night's rain. Rosa traced Anthony's name on the stone and whispered, "You always ran toward the fire." Frank stood back, hands in pockets, watching her shoulders shake. Detective Carter said, "Graves get robbed for leverage." Frank said, "They want me rattled." Carter looked at Rosa and said, "They want her broken." A crow hopped along the marble edge, bold as a thief. Rosa said, "I am not porcelain." She wiped her face and faced Frank. "If Sal did this, you end it today." Frank saw Anthony at 20, laughing with a busted lip, and his breath caught. "I taught him to fight," he said, "and I buried him anyway." Carter's radio crackled like ice. "Evidence came back hot," he said. "Gas residue from the pier matches Russo garages." Frank nodded once. Rosa said, "Then what are we still doing here?" The crow took flight, and the morning felt colder than the night. They drove to Bayonne, where the Russo garages sat like clenched fists by the water. Vinny met them in an alley that smelled of salt and propane. 2 lookouts, he said, pointing to the roofline. 1 truck loaded last night. Frank said, we go quiet. Rosa said, we go honest. She reached into her jacket and pulled a chain with Anthony's St. Michael. He hated lies, she said, and slipped it over her neck. The chain shone like a dare. Carter said, you step inside, you stay behind me. Frank gave him a look that had ended arguments and started wars. She stays with me, he said. Vinny spat and said, Russo's nephew runs this spot. Kid thinks he's royalty. Frank said, princes bleed. The wind off the water carried a diesel cough and the ghost of burned rubber. Rosa breathed it in like medicine and nodded. Let's pull the bandage, she said. Inside the garage, the floor wore tire burns like signatures. A stripped sedan hunched on blocks and the air tasted of stale smoke. A teenager with a pistol lifted his chin. You lost, he said. Frank said, where's your uncle? The kid's eyes flicked to an office with blinds half shut. Carter said, gun down, kid, or I write your future. Rosa stepped forward, hands open. He was my uncle too, she said softly. The kid's arm shook. Liar, he said. Vinny moved along the wall, silent as a rumor. Frank said, they dug my brother to bait me. The kid blinked, and something cracked behind his stare. A second lookout slid from behind a pillar, and Carter's voice turned iron. Don't. Silence held for 3 long beats, then broke like glass as the office door opened. Salvatore Russo's nephew walked out smiling like a borrowed knife, and said, welcome to family business. Frank stared at the nephew's silk shirt, and saw a child pretending to survive a storm. You dug Anthony, Frank said, each word a stone. The nephew shrugged. Someone did, he said. And it worked. Rosa said, you want a crown you didn't earn. He laughed and touched the gold at his throat. Carter said, I can take this whole place on paperwork. The nephew's smile thinned. Paper burns, he said. Vinny coughed a warning as 2 more men appeared behind the office door. We done parading, Frank said, or do we dance? The nephew's eyes lit with greed. You want Sal, he said. I want proof, you can bleed. He snapped his fingers. A crate lid lifted, revealing teeth in a jar, pale as moon seeds. Rosa whispered, Anthony, and the room tilted. Frank stepped closer, and the nephew flinched despite himself. Now we dance, Frank said. The first punch sounded like a book closing on a lie. Vinny hit the bigger guard, and the garage exploded into motion. Carter's command voice pinned the teenager to the floor without a shot. Rosa moved to the crate, choking back rage. No more graves, she said, and slammed the jar into the concrete, teeth scattering like hail. The nephew lunged for Frank with a switchblade and found a veteran's answer. Frank twisted his wrist and said, Tell Sal I'm done whispering. The blade skittered away. Sirens bled into the distance, as if the city exhaled. The nephew spat blood and said, You're late. The docks are already gone. Frank felt the old world tilt. Rosa took his arm and said, Then we take them back. Carter looked at the shattered jar and said, You just raised the price. Frank stared the nephew down. Then let Jersey send the bill. The nephew's blood dried brown on Frank's cuff before the guilt could. Rosa paced the apartment, counting breaths like bullets. He said the docks are gone, she said. So what did we miss? Frank studied a map riddled with thumbtacks. We missed the tide, he said, and tapped a red string that crossed Bayonne to Newark. Detective Carter set a folder down and said, Russo fronts move cash through a phony recycling plant. Vinny said, Trucks roll at dusk, no manifests. Frank said, Then we cut the trucks at the docks. Carter rubbed his eyes and said, You bring knives to a warrant, I lose my badge. Rosa stared him down and said, Bring the badge later. The room smelled of bourbon, bleach, and fear learning to stand. We hit fast, Frank said, and we hit clean. Outside, sirens slid by like snakes that had already eaten. Dusk painted the Newark docks a bruised purple. Forklifts crawled like beetles around stacked containers. Rosa whispered, 3 guards on rotation, 1 smoking. Frank said, the smoker talks first. Carter keyed his radio and said, uniforms are 10 minutes out. Vinny slung a chain and said, we need 6. Frank saw the river as a throat, and the containers as teeth. We choke the flow, he said. They moved between shadows that smelled of salt and diesel. The smoker met Rosa's eyes and hesitated, which was Mercy's final act. Tell Sal I'm done paying rent, Frank said, and put him to sleep without a gunshot. A truck engine coughed awake like a traitor. Somewhere deeper in the maze, a horn wailed, and the night snapped tight. The precinct lights felt like interrogation even in the hallway. Carter walked the nephew past glass doors while lawyers sniffed opportunity. Talk now, Carter said, before Sal trades you for nails. The kid sneered, then swallowed. You think he keeps books, he said, but he keeps bones. Frank stood behind the 2-way mirror, jaw clenched enough to crack. Rosa said, if he knows the route, he knows the leak. Vinny said, who's feeding him maps? The kid's voice broke through the speaker like a wire saw. Your docs died when a Merino opened the gate, he said. Carter's chin lifted. Name. The kid smiled with a split lip and said, ask the waitress who always forgets your coffee. Frank felt the diner walls roll back like a tide that always returns. They returned to the diner where the coffee always tasted like confessions. The jukebox slept, and the rain wrote lines on the glass. The waitress, Maria, smiled too quickly and said, just you. Frank said, just truth. Rosa's gaze cut the room like a blade that remembered every scar. Who sits in booth 3 on Thursdays, she asked, and orders for ghosts? Maria's hands shook. Delivery guys, she said, maybe Teamsters. Carter laid a photo of the recycling plant on the counter. You call this number before shifts, he said. A door chime rang, and the air changed temperature. Vinny said, we've got tails. Maria whispered, I didn't want blood. Frank said, you chose it anyway. Headlights washed the windows, and every exit felt smaller than a breath. The tails were not subtle, and subtlety was out of fashion. 2 SUVs idled like wolves at the curb. Frank said, we walk out into the storm. Carter nodded and said, we pull them down the block. Rosa touched her chain and said, no more running. Vinny cracked his knuckles and said, let's sweep the street. The door opened, and the rain hit like applause that hated you. A voice from the SUV shouted, Merino, and the windows rolled down on 4 muzzles. Frank dragged Rosa behind a lamppost as rounds chewed neon. Carter's sidearm spoke 3 times, precise and cold. Tires screamed, a bumper clipped a hydrant, and water geysered like the city finally crying. The SUVs fled east, but one phone buzzed on the pavement, still calling a name Frank feared. He picked it up and heard Eva's breath break into a sob. Phone hissed like a snake that knew their names, and Eva's voice came through jagged with rain. Frank, she said, don't come home. Rosa froze, as if the word mother were a fuse. Frank said, where are you? Eva breathed hard. St. Bridget's parking lot, she said. 2 cars, no plates. Carter mouthed trap and lifted his radio. Vinny said, Russo wants you to chase. Eva whispered, they said Anthony's bones weren't the last. The apartment felt smaller than a confession booth. Stay on the line, Frank said, and grabbed his coat. Rosa said, if she sold us, I want the receipt. Carter said, we go with lights in our pockets. Outside, thunder rolled like bad debt. Frank said, she was my wife before she was your story. And Rosa's jaw trembled then steadied. She still chose a chapter, Rosa said, and tucked the chain into her collar. The city held its breath, and the line went dead. St. Bridget's lot glistened like a wound, and Eva stood under a busted light that blinked like doubt. She was 43 and tired in a way only secrets cause. Eva said, "They watch from the rectory roof." Carter scanned the eaves. "Two silhouettes," he said. Rosa stepped forward, voice a flint. "Did you call Sal?" she asked, when Anthony vanished. Eva's lips shook. "I called a number he used," she said. "I was scared of debt." Frank's face was winter. "Debt you paid with a brother," he said. Vinny muttered, eyes on the bell tower. A car door clicked by the alley. Eva said, "They want the docks at midnight, or they take Rosa." Frank's hands opened, then closed. "Nobody takes my daughter," he said. Eva whispered, "I thought fear would save us." Rosa said, "Fear only rents the room," and thunder stitched the sky. A bell tolled once, and a muzzle flash winked from the roof like a cruel star. Carter shoved Eva down and barked positions as concrete spat chips. Rosa said, "Left parapet," and sprinted to the statue's base. Frank's breath burned old years. He vaulted the hood of a sedan and said, "Cover." Vinny's chain sang against brick, and found a wrist that dropped a pistol. The shooter cursed, rolled and vanished behind the cross. Eva curled behind a pillar and sobbed. "I didn't know." Frank said, "You knew enough to look away." Sirens trembled in the distance like promises you want and dread. Rosa yelled, "I have a ladder," and Carter nodded sharp. "We take one alive," he said, "or the story stays theirs." Thunder rumbled, and the rain returned to finish what the first storm began. They hauled the rooftop gunman over the ledge like bad laundry. He was 25 and loyal to money. Carter pinned him and said, "Midnight where?" The kid smiled through blood. "Doc C," he said, "bring flowers." Frank said, "Bring a priest." Rosa leaned close and said, "Who fed you our roots?" He blinked rain and fear. "The waitress," he said, "and the wife." Eva flinched like a struck match. "I called once," she said. "Then he owned me." Frank's voice was low and final. "Sal owns nothing," he said. The kid coughed. "He owns the river." Vinny said, "Rivers change course." Carter read the kid his rights with a tone that sounded like Mercy's cousin. Rosa's eyes found Eva's, and did not blink. "You do not get to vanish," she said. Eva nodded and cried without sound, as lightning scrubbed the sky clean. They gathered inside the nave where candles made liars of the dark. Water dripped from coats like coins. Frank faced Eva with the weight of 2 decades between them. "You phoned the grave," he said, "and called it survival." Eva whispered, "I called it love gone hungry." Rosa stood between them and chose steel over softness. "Hunger is not a reason," she said. "It is a knife." Carter set his radio on the altar rail and said, "Midnight at Dock C, heavy cruise, unknown number of shooters." Vinny said, "We bring friends who do not ask questions." Frank touched the font and said, "No more saints." Eva reached for Rosa's hand and stopped halfway. "Let me help," she said, "or let me pay." Frank looked at his daughter and saw Anthony's stubborn light. "We end this," he said, "and we end it with our names." The candles guttered and the plan took flame. The rain stopped before midnight, leaving the air heavy with the taste of steel and salt. Dock C loomed ahead, cranes frozen like gallows against the skyline. Frank said, "We walk in like we own it." Rosa's eyes narrowed. "We don't own anything until they're gone." Carter loaded a fresh magazine and said, "We stay sharp, this is their turf, not ours." Vinny checked his chain and muttered, "Then let's redecorate." Eva stood at the edge of the group, face pale but set. "I'll draw them out," she said. Frank shook his head. "You've drawn enough." The hum of idling engines drifted from the far end of the pier. Frank took one last look at the black water and said, "Once we step on, we don't step back." Rosa whispered, "Then step." The night swallowed their shadows as they moved forward, the wooden planks groaning under the weight of old vendettas. They moved between stacks of shipping containers, shadows long and broken under the pier lamps. Carter signaled 2 fingers, then pointed right. Vinny slipped into the gap, vanishing like a knife into cloth. Rosa heard low voices ahead, 3 men, armed. Frank whispered, "We flank them." Eva stayed back, her breath clouding in the cold. One of the guards lit a cigarette, its flare reflecting in his eyes. Rosa stepped out, chain at her neck catching the lamplight. "Looking for me?" she asked. The man froze. Frank came from behind, silent as the tide, and pressed him into the steel wall. Carter disarmed the second, with a twist and a grunt. The third fled deeper into the maze, shouting Sal's name like a warning shot. Frank said, "Let him run." Rosa smirked. "He won't get far." Gunfire cracked from the pier's far end, echoing off metal like breaking glass. Carter ducked behind a container, shouting, "Positions!" Rosa crouched low, drawing breath steady. Frank spotted 2 silhouettes on the crane catwalk. "Oh, hi," he said, pointing. Vinny tossed his chain upward, catching a rung and hauling himself halfway before a shot sparked near his boot. Eva scrambled for cover, heart hammering loud enough she swore they'd hear it. One of the shooters laughed, the sound brittle as ice. "Welcome to the river," he called. Frank replied with a single round that shattered the lamp beside the man's head, plunging the catwalk into shadow. "Now we hunt," Frank growled. The air stank of gunpowder and rust, and the black water below licked the pier in hungry laps. The first catwalk shooter went down hard, clanging against the steel before vanishing into the dark water. The second hesitated too long. Vinny's chain wrapped his wrist and yanked him over the rail. Carter climbed the last ladder and signaled all clear. "That's 2, he said, "but not Sal." Rosa stepped to the edge and stared at the black ripples below. "Sharks feed at night," she said softly. Frank scanned the yard. A container door hung ajar, light bleeding from within. "That's him," Frank said. Eva whispered, "Be sure." Frank gave her a look that wasn't for strangers. "I am." He stepped forward, every footfall heavy with the weight of 2 decades. Behind him, Rosa said, "If you kill him, I want to see it." Frank didn't look back. "Then don't blink." The open container smelled of gasoline and old wood. Salvatore Russo sat inside on a folding chair, hands resting on his knees, a revolver balanced like an afterthought. He was 50, but time had worn him sharper, not duller. "Frank," he said, "come to finish the story." Frank stepped inside, gun low. "I came to write the last line." Rosa stood in the doorway, breath steady. Sal smiled faintly. "Your father dug graves with his hands. You dig them with your heart." Frank's jaw worked. "Anthony wasn't yours to touch." Sal's eyes flicked to Eva, who stood frozen at the threshold. "She called me first." Eva flinched, tears carving lines down her cheeks. Carter's voice cut through. "Enough talk." Frank raised his gun. Sal chuckled once, a sound that died halfway. The shot echoed through Dock Sea, scattering gulls into the night sky. Sal's body was still cooling when the silence cracked. From deeper in the yard, diesel engines roared to life, headlights cutting through the mist. Carter said, "We're not done." Frank glanced at Rosa. "Stay close." Vinny leaned out the container door, chain swinging. "We got company." Eva pressed her back against the wall, eyes wide. "I thought he was the end." Frank shook his head. He was the fuse. Tires screeched on wet planks, and black SUVs surged into the pier. Rosa slid a fresh mag into her pistol. "Then we burn it all." Frank's gaze swept the yard like a man counting graves. "No," he said. "We leave a message." Carter stepped forward, sidearm high. "Whatever we do, we finish it here." Thunder cracked again, but this time it was all from the muzzles lighting the night. The first SUV skidded sideways, blocking the pier. Gunmen spilled out, faces hidden under black hoods. Carter fired, dropping one before he could aim. Rosa moved low and fast, bullets sparking off steel behind her. Vinny swung his chain into a hooded man's jaw, the crack sharp and final. Frank advanced toward the lead SUV, shots tight and deliberate. "Push them back," he shouted. Eva crawled behind a stack of crates, clutching her coat closed. One gunman took position high on a container, muzzle flashing. Rosa pivoted, 2 quick shots sending him tumbling. Carter reloaded in a crouch. "They're trained," he said. Frank's eyes narrowed. "They're desperate." The smell of burned powder filled the damp air, and the water slapped the pier like impatient hands. A blast from the far end shook the pier. Someone had lit a fuel drum. Fire bloomed, reflecting in the black water like a second, burning world. Carter yelled, "That's our cover and their distraction." Frank grabbed Rosa's arm. Flank left, cut them off at the ramp. Vinny charged through smoke, chain whipping sparks from the rail. Eva stayed low, coughing as the fumes thickened. A hooded man rushed her, knife in hand. Rosa's shot dropped him before he reached her. "Stay down," Rosa said, pulling her toward safety. Frank reached the ramp just as 2 SUVs tried to reverse out. He stepped into the headlights, gun steady. "Nobody leaves," he said, and the words felt like they belonged to the night itself. The gunfire ebbed, replaced by groans and the hiss of burning diesel. Frank walked among the fallen, kicking weapons away. Carter cuffed the last conscious gunman. "Who sent you?" The man spat blood. "We all answer to the river." Rosa's face was stone. "Then drown in it." Eva stood apart, staring at the flames as if they could rewrite her choices. Vinny wiped blood from his cheek. "We're clear," he said. Frank shook his head. "Not yet. Someone still moves the money." Carter looked toward the cranes. "You think it's here?" Frank's voice dropped. "I think it's leaving." A distant horn blared over the water, and the shape of a cargo ship slid into the harbor's mouth. The ship's deck lights carved pale ladders across the water. Frank said, "That's the last vein in this city's heart." Carter adjusted his radio. "We can call it in. Customs will lock it down." Frank shook his head. "By then, it's ghosts." Rosa stepped forward. "Then we take it now." Eva's voice wavered. "You'll never make it aboard." Vinny grinned grimly. "We don't need all of us." Frank scanned each face. "We go together." The ship loomed closer, its engines thrumming like a giant's pulse. The pier creaked as they moved to the loading crane. Carter looked up at the climb ahead. "This is madness," he said. Frank smirked. "No, it's Jersey." The crane's hook swung toward the deck, and they stepped into the night air above the water. The crane hook swung them over the black water, wind biting at their faces. The cargo ship loomed, steel skin glistening under deck lights. Frank landed first, gun raised. Rosa dropped beside him, eyes sharp. Carter followed, scanning both flanks. Vinny hit the deck with a grunt, chain already in motion. Crewmen, in oilskins, froze mid-step. "Where's your captain?" Frank barked. One pointed toward the bridge without a word. Eva's voice came through Carter's radio. "Harbor patrol's 15 out. You've got minutes." Frank said, "We only need seconds." Boots clanged on the steel as they moved toward the bridge. Shadows stretched long in the deck lights. The smell of salt and diesel mixed with something sharper, fear rising from the men who knew the tide had turned. They reached the bridge door, locked and bolted. Vinny swung his chain once, twice, snapping it open. Inside, red instrument lights painted the captain's face. He was calm, too calm. "You think killing Sal ends it?" he said. Frank stepped forward. "No, this ends it." Rosa moved to the helm, scanning manifests spread across the console. "They're moving more than cash," she said. Carter lifted a sat phone from the desk. "Encrypted," he muttered. The captain's lips curled. "By the time you read it, the city's already bought." Vinny slammed him against the wall. "Not tonight." Outside a horn wailed, and the ship slowed, the harbor lights growing nearer. Frank looked at Rosa. "Burn the papers." She struck a match without hesitation. The fire spread fast, curling black smoke toward the ceiling. Carter said, "We've got to move." Frank grabbed the sat phone, stuffing it into his coat. Rosa swept the burning papers off the console, flames catching on the deck. The captain snarled, "You're burning more than you know." Frank replied, "Some things deserve the fire." Vinny kicked the door open, smoke spilling into the night air. Crewmen scattered as alarms wailed. Eva's voice cut through static on the radio. 2 more boats inbound. Carter glanced at Frank. "Friends or not?" Frank shook his head. "Not." The harbor lights flashed across their faces, making them look like ghosts walking out of the blaze. On deck, the air was colder, but not clean. 2 speedboats tore across the water, wakes glinting under moonlight. Gunfire sparked from their bows. Carter returned fire, his shots cracking across the waves. Rosa crouched behind a crate, aiming between the blasts. Vinny coiled his chain around a railing, ready for boarding. Frank moved toward the crane control, eyes fixed on the swinging cargo net. "When they get close," he shouted. As the first boat neared, Frank dropped the net hard, crushing its bow into the steel hull. The second swerved, its gunman spinning out into the dark water. The roar of engines faded, replaced by the distant sound of harbor patrol sirens. By the time the harbor patrol boarded, the ship was quiet except for the groan of steel cooling in the night. The captain was gone, overboard or vanished into the hold. Frank stood at the rail, the sat phone heavy in his pocket. Rosa joined him, her breath still sharp. "It's over?" she asked. Frank shook his head. It never is." Carter lit a cigarette, the ember flaring against the dark. Vinny leaned on the railing, watching the patrol boat circle. Eva waited by the gangway, eyes on Frank. "You came back," she said. He didn't answer. The city's skyline glittered beyond the harbor, cold and distant. "There's no retirement plan for ghosts," Frank said quietly. And with that, they walked down the gangway, carrying the night with them.